Looking at this peaceful valley, it's hard to fathom that a war bloodier than the Hatfield-McCoy feud and more violent than the OK Corral shootout was fought here. What occurred in this location delayed Arizona's statehood for nearly 30 years, and it all started with two friends. This distinction belongs to the Pleasant Valley War, often called the Graham-Tewksbury Feud, named for those two friends. Max Lerner once noted, the so-called lessons of history are for the most part the rationalizations of the victors. History is written by the survivors. This theory was never more evident than in the bloody history of the Pleasant Valley War. Each event has multiple versions of what really happened. The viewer must weigh the evidence.
In America, of course, the Hatfield-McCoy feud is probably the most widely known, but that was sort of a schoolyard fight when compared to the Pleasant Valley War in Arizona. I mean, a few people got into a quarrel over a missing hog back in the Hatfield-McCoy country, and eventually some people were hurt and killed. But out here, 50 men probably died in the real war that lasted over 15 years.
Arizona had been trying to become a state. When this lawlessness started and made headlines all over the country at that time, it really set back the statehood about 30 years. They figured that any territory that lawless was not ready for statehood yet.
The very idea of giving 2 senators to a state that had fewer residents than a borough of Boston was unthinkable. And so as this violence went along for 15 years, it helped to delay statehood, I think.
Certainly it was a wonderful place, being a beautiful valley and being with lush grass, knee-high, to go and escape whatever your past might have been. And certainly a lot of young men took advantage of that. Some had been outlaws before, some had been in prison before, prison escapees before. It was a good place simply to get away from the world, but it probably didn't work any better in those days than it does today for people coming to Arizona to escape their past.
In 1881, John Tewksbury Sr. brought his family of 4 sons and a new wife to the Pleasant Valley area in the Arizona Territory. The boys were named John Jr., Frank, Jim, and Edwin. The boys' deceased mother was an Indian, making them half-breeds. Whether or not hatred along racial lines played any part in the brutality that followed is open to debate. Edwin Tewksbury would become the central figure of the feud and came to be known as the Last Man.
Well, Edwin Tewksbury, what kind of a person was he? He was a guy not to mess with. There was ample accounting of how good he was with a gun and how he wasn't to be trifled with. He was a man of impeccable personal courage and behavior. I think toward the end of his life, he probably drank more than he should have, but he also never wavered in his loyalty toward those he deemed to be his friends.
The Tewksburys were known for their tremendous string of excellent horses, and the Pleasant Valley ranges were choice lands for their enterprise. In addition to their prized blooded horses, the Tewksburys also held interests in cattle, pigs, and sheep in the Tonto Basin ranges. It is their ownership of some sheep which often leads to their being classified as leaning toward the sheep interests in the cattle versus sheep factions of the feud. When sheep graze a land, they eat every scrap of feed and leave it virtually barren, whereas a cow will only eat the very top portion of the feed, leaving the plant free to grow feed again. Cattlemen see the sheep flocks as raping the lands of feed for their cash crop, which is cattle. Thus, the two sides are enemies. The main holder of sheep interests in Pleasant Valley were the Daggs. Their ranges bordered the Tewksburys. They were business partners. For this reason, the Tewksburys sided with the sheep interests in the range wars.
Well, the Daggs brothers were about the largest sheepmen in Arizona at that time. They raised their sheep on top of the Mogollon Rim. They had evidently contacted the Tewksburys and arranged some sort of a share type deal with them, where the Tewksburys would bring the sheep in on their range on shares. So the Tewksburys had at least 3,000 or 4,000 sheep on their range. At least that's what they declared on their tax notices.
This story begins in 1882 when Edwin Tewksbury met a young cowboy named Tom Graham. The two became fast friends. Tom was a cattleman, and he told Edwin that he was looking for a place to raise cattle. Edwin suggested an area in Pleasant Valley, not far from his own ranges.
Tom seemed to be a very slow, plodding man, not terribly clever at business, caught up on many occasions, kind of left hanging with people who owed him money that he couldn't collect. But he certainly seemed to be a very serious but easygoing young man.
Tom Graham met Edwin Tewksbury in a bar in Globe, and Edwin told Tom how great Pleasant Valley was as far as raising cattle, and what a beautiful place it was. And Tom Graham told Edwin Tewksbury that he was interested in starting his own cattle business, and that he and his brother John Graham were looking for a place to set up a spread, so to speak. Edwin took Tom Graham to Pleasant Valley and showed him around. Tom was pretty impressed with the place and eventually brought his brother John and their half-brother Billy into Pleasant Valley. And the Tewksburys actually helped them build a cabin. Later on, the bad blood occurred.
For 2 years, the Grahams and Tewksburys worked together and considered each other to be friends. They often teamed up on ventures. One of those proved to be rustling cattle to fatten their own herds. In the West, cattle and horses were often the targets of rustlers who were quick to slap a brand on an unbranded animal.
Well, everybody was rustling from everybody else. There's an old saying in the West that you never eat your own beef. And there's another saying in the West that some years we had phenomenal calf crops. Some of our cows had 4 or 5 calves, which is genetically unheard of.
The outlaws from Texas and New Mexico had come into here. They would steal horses from the north, bring them through Pleasant Valley, and rest, and then they would go on to the Phoenix area. They would steal horses down there, bring them back through Pleasant Valley, and take them up as far north as Colorado to sell them.
Another favorite trick was to alter a brand by using a running iron, which is a bent piece of steel that rustlers use to make either curved or straight lines, depending on which way the hot metal branding implement touched the hide.
I've seen somewhere that an old Arizona cowman said that he was incapable of writing his own name, but he could draw the U.S. Constitution on the side of a cow with a running iron.
Branding was the chief identifying mark for claiming ownership of stock. If a cow or horse was unbranded, or another brand could be developed out of the existing brand, then ownership of the animal was simply transferred to the rustler.
I think that probably always the big herder in an area would assume that a certain amount of shrinkage would occur. And many a small rancher in Arizona got his start by appropriating a few head of cattle from the big one.
It is ironic that this rustling enterprise, which brought them together, is also the one which would tear them apart.
They went in together and stole James Stinson's cattle. He was a large rancher here. And after a time, they started quarreling a bit. The Grahams went to the county seat, registered the brand in their own name, obviously leaving the Tewksburys out in the cold. So when the Tewksburys found this out, that was one of the reasons that they started their hatred for each other.
On January 12, 1884, some cowboys from the James Stinson cattle outfit, the very first in Pleasant Valley, rode up to the Tewksbury ranches. Stinson had been losing huge numbers of cattle, and his men were looking for missing stock. Their search brought them right to the Tewksburys' door. Present that day with the Tewksburys were both Graham brothers. Edwin Tewksbury asked them who they were hunting, and the answer given in return was, U-S-O-B. Tempers flared, hotheads drew guns, and shots were exchanged. Edwin Tewksbury shot 16-year-old Elisha Gilliland in the back as his horse reared. The shooting of Gilliland was the first blood spilled in what would soon become a very bloody war. At the trial, John Graham testified that Gilliland drew first. He even had a bullet hole in his hat to show the court. This gunfight was the last time the Grahams and the Tewksburys were on the same side. Soon after the gunfight, trial, and acquittals, James Stinson approached the Graham brothers with a proposition. He asked them to help protect his cattle interests. In order to do this, they would have to turn on their friends and neighbors, the Tewksburys.
The contract that James Stinson and the Graham brothers entered into was actually recorded as an official document in the courthouse in Prescott, Arizona. This is not legend, it's not a myth, it actually happened. And within 6 months, this happened in 1884, the Grahams had satisfied themselves that they had enough evidence to accuse the Tewksburys of cattle rustling.
Maybe the Tewksburys' interest in sheep facilitated this mutiny by their close friends. But since the Grahams had thinned Stinson's herds themselves, this was a very strange partnership.
For each conviction that the Grahams, as range detectives, could bring, they were going to get 20 head of cattle as their reward. They went about their business pretty efficiently. What this precipitated was, upon the Tewksburys, was a necessity to travel these huge distances to appear in court for various kinds of charges, and they had ample time to be angry about that and eventually probably seek revenge.
As evidence of the Tewksburys' rustling, the Grahams confessed to taking part in it with them. The judge awarded an acquittal for all defendants and cited the Grahams for perjury. What had been a close friendship quickly turned into a bloody nightmare. In late 1884 or early 1885, the Blevins family acquired the ranch at Canyon Creek. Some accounts say that Andrew Arnold Blevins, more widely known as Andy Cooper, the oldest Blevins boy, moved into the ranch house of a Mormon family while they were away in Salt Lake City. Another version had Andy Cooper forcing the family off the land at gunpoint and allowing them to take only what they could carry. Whatever the truth is, Canyon Creek Ranch became the central location for Andy's cattle and horse-stealing ventures.
Andy Cooper was a hot shot. He liked to brag. He liked to drink. He was totally lawless, as far as I can tell. He had no sense of justice, no respect for anybody.
low life, nasty, mean, opportunistic, a guy without any real moral restraints whatsoever.
Andy went by the alias of Cooper because he was on the run from the law in Texas, where there was a warrant for his arrest on a charge of murder. When he settled on Canyon Creek Ranch, he sent for his family to follow him west from Texas. Considered soft-spoken and honest by friends and family, Andy was considered ruthless and without moral conviction by everyone else. Andy's father, Mark Blevins, more widely known as Old Man Blevins, had 4 other sons whom a newspaper of the day called chips off the old block. In addition to Andy, there was a Hamp, Charlie, John, and Sam Houston Blevins. Together, the Blevins gang led horse and cattle stealing raids on the areas surrounding their ranch. Avid haters of sheep and sheep interests, the Blevins gang soon came to be associated with the Grahams and the cattle interests in the feud. Andy Cooper's involvement in the brutality would become the stuff of infamy. In February of 1887, the bloodiest year of the feud began with the discovery of the body of a sheep herder. Reporters said that this body was riddled with bullets, and that most grisly of all, his head was missing. The main suspect in the killing was John Blevins. The chasm between the two factions was ever widening. In early August 1887, Old Man Blevins set out on a journey, reportedly to find some missing horses. He found evidence of their theft and set out to recover them. He was never seen again. His horse and his rifle were recovered near the Tewksbury Ranges. On August 9th, a small search party was assembled to search for Old Man Blevins. The group, consisting mostly of those associated with the Graham faction, including the Blevins, came to the Middleton Ranch, owned by Tewksbury sympathizer George Newton. They were met at the door by Jim Tewksbury.
According to different testimonies, Johnny Payne knocked on the door with either his knuckles or the butt of his pistol. And at that time, Jim Tewksbury reportedly asked him, "What do you want?" He said, "We're hungry, we want something to eat." Jim Tewksbury replied, "This ain't no damn boarding house." And from there, different testimonies as to what happened, but the shooting started right after that. Johnny Payne, Hampton Blevins were killed, and Tom Tucker and Bob Glaspie were wounded.
The thing is that the Tewksburys, of course, wanted to place the blame on the affray squarely on the shoulders of Hamp Blevins. Hamp, from his photograph, appeared to only have one arm. And they claimed that while on horseback, Hamp started to draw his gun and fire upon them. And it seems like it would be a little bit difficult task for a one-armed man to do that while on horseback.
Inside the cabin was almost the entire Tewksbury faction of marksmen, with guns trained on the riders. Hamp was the second Blevins to be killed in less than 2 weeks. When the Grahams returned a couple of days later to retrieve and bury their dead, they found the Middleton cabin abandoned by the Tewksburys. Before leaving, they burned it to the ground. On August 17th, William Graham, the younger brother of John and Tom, was rounding up horses near the Graham ranches. According to one version, he came across Apache County Deputy Jim Houck. What happened and who drew first is still disputed.
Billy or William Graham murder was one of the most despicable things that happened during the Pleasant Valley War. The young man was fairly fresh from the Midwest, had not been involved in any way, shape, or form, and I think he was used as a tool primarily by the Tewksburys in order to convince the Grahams that they really meant business.
Houck's story was he thought that William Graham was his older brother John. Upon realizing that he wasn't, Houck said he had shouted to William, "I'm not hunting you." Houck claimed that William responded by saying that he was hunting him, then drew his gun. William Graham was gunshot, but still alive. The wound was so severe, by the time he reached the ranch, his intestines were hanging almost to the ground.
He was many miles from home, and the wound was gruesome. His inside spilled out. He said I'd have died there, but I was afraid that then I would have been the reason for my brothers to come out looking for me. So he gathered himself up and rode home and arrived and fainted in their arms.
We don't know for sure if he was intentionally ambushed or if it was just a chance meeting on the trail, but the coroner's inquest clearly indicates that Ed Tewksbury was indeed the murderer, and in fact Billy Graham gave that as his dying declaration.
Inside the Graham Ranch, William's intestines were washed, stuffed back in his abdomen, and he was sewn up with needle and thread. Badly wounded and suffering, he died.
The daughter of Tom Graham said that's when they went to war to gain revenge for Billy's death.
Enraged, Tom Graham, with a group of gunmen, including the calloused Andy Cooper, went to the Tewksbury Ranch, where they intended to put an end to the Tewksburys. They concealed themselves and waited.
September 2nd, 1887, the Tewksbury Ranch came under attack from the Grahams and the Blevins. I believe John Graham and Tom Graham were there, along with possibly Andy Cooper, maybe some of the other Blevins boys. John Tewksbury and Bill Jacobs were killed. They were out gathering horses in the morning and were ambushed in what's known as Dead Man's Canyon.
In the early morning hours of September 2nd, John Tewksbury Jr. and William Jacobs left the Tewksbury cabin to round up horses. What happened next is without a doubt one of the most gruesome moments of the Pleasant Valley War. The only man to ever lay claim to the killings was Andy Cooper. The Tewksburys, alerted by the gunfire, barricaded themselves in their cabin. The Graham forces then began a gunfight with the Tewksburys that reports say lasted 10 days. Meanwhile, the bodies of John and William lay where they fell. Wild hogs came upon the bodies and began a grisly feast. One version of the story had Mary Ann, John's wife, defiantly going out and driving away the hogs, digging a shallow grave and burying her husband. The cowboys who had just ambushed her husband allowed her to carry out this task. When she returned to the cabin, the gunfight began anew.
The story about the hogs devouring the bodies is partially true. The hogs did eat the bodies. However, the part about John Tewksbury's widow, Mary Ann, stopping the gunfight in front of the cabin and going out and burying the bodies with the baby toted on her hip and the shovel in the other hand is pure hogwash. She was 8.5 months pregnant at the time.
Close to 100 miles away on the morning of September 4th, witnesses stated that Andy Cooper was in the Bucket of Blood saloon in Holbrook. He was bragging about killing Tewksbury and a man he did not know. Soon, this small town will be rocked to its foundations with its own bloody testament to the times. In 1887, Holbrook, Arizona, had less than 300 citizens. The town had the Atlantic and Pacific railroads coming through. Drunken cowboys and revelers reportedly shot up the town on a regular basis. One report as to how the Bucket of Blood saloon got its name was that a member of the infamous Dalton gang killed 2 Mexicans right in the doorway. By the time the law arrived, they had bled a bucket of blood. Commodore Owens drifted into Arizona territory around 1881 and quickly made a name for himself with his gun.
Commodore Owens was, I think if I had lived at that time, he would have been my hero. He was honest in all his dealings. He kept his sheriff's records down to the postage stamps. I mean, he kept track of every penny he spent. He was quiet, mild-mannered, but he was also probably the best shot in the whole West. His contemporaries said that no one was as good a marksman as he was.
Will Barnes, a grassroots historian, claimed to have seen Commodore Owens display his expertise with a pistol on many occasions. Owens nearly always carried 2 revolvers and could draw either with his right or left hand with wonderful speed. Several times on the roundups, I had seen him stand 20 feet from an empty tomato can and keep it rolling and jumping with alternate shots from his 2 guns until the can was torn to pieces. During his tenure as sheriff, a mob assembled to take a prisoner from him, a Mexican who had killed a card dealer. The mob assembled at the jailhouse. Owens stepped out and said, "Before you take him, you'll have to kill me, and there ain't enough of you." The mob is alleged to have taken the high ground rather than face Owens' guns. Indians feared Owens. At first they called him Long Hair, but later he became known as Iron Man or Ghost Man. With regard to these monikers, Little Chief, a Navajo chief, supposedly claimed that they had killed Owens many times. But he either would not die, or by some magic the bullets bounced off him harmlessly. It is told in legend that whenever Owens spotted a party of Indians, he would shake his hair and charge them. Upon seeing the ghost man, they would scatter. Rustling and thefts continued, creating great pressures on Owens to do something. He was also criticized by the Indian agents in the area because of his zeal to go into reservations to arrest Indian rustlers.
Commodore Owens shot a young Navajo, and the young Navajo's dying words were, "I was shot and killed by Commodore Owens, and I don't know why."
Some had supposed that his hatred of the Indians was clouding his judgment.
So the Navajos would go in at night and steal 20, 30 horses, and this was hurting the stage company. So they hired Owens to get rid of the Navajos who were stealing horses. Well, he did in short order. And I think that's where all the business of him being an Indian hater arose. I don't really think he was. I think he just hated people who stole things. He hated horse thieves and cow thieves.
Owens had a hard time keeping bonded by the wealthy citizens, whose interests he was supposed to be protecting. Citizens wanted Andy Cooper. Will Barnes theorized that Owens knew if he went after Cooper, one or the other was bound to die. Even the newspapers printed theories that Owens feared facing Cooper.
Commodore Owens was having trouble with the Board of Supervisors. They came down really hard on him because he hadn't brought Andy Cooper in. And they actually threatened to fire him. They said, you lose your job if you don't bring him in. You've had this warrant for a long time. Now just do it.
Whether by fate or by prior knowledge, September 4th found Commodore Perry Owens and Andy Cooper in the same town. The unfolding of the gunfight and the testimonies that followed it are disputed to this day. Commodore Owens arrived in Holbrook in the afternoon and rode directly to the Brown and Kinder livery stable. As Commodore Owens contemplated what to do, he started to clean his guns. He was met by druggist and sometimes deputy Frank Watrin.
Cooper's getting ready to leave.
Owens promptly finished his cleaning. Watrin reportedly offered to round up a posse to help him, but Owens declined, thinking that innocent men might die if they did.
The Lone Gunman, almost scripted by Hollywood, if Hollywood had existed at that time. All alone, no one backing him up, going unsupported to a house and knocking on the door with the intention of arresting somebody inside.
I really believe in the beginning that Commodore Owens hoped he would get Andy at home with his family, thinking that he would not resist arrest if he had the women and children there. I think he was hoping against hope that's what would happen.
As Owens walked up to the front porch of the Blevins residence, he saw Andy Cooper, John Blevins, and a third person in the west front room. Standing out front, Owens yelled,
"Cooper, I want you!"
Commodore Owens, we feel certain, was very much aware that John Blevins and Andy Cooper had both been in Pleasant Valley and may well have been involved in the Tewksbury and Jacobs murder just a few days before. He may have been in Pleasant Valley himself almost at the same time. He may have nearly tracked Andy and John back to Holbrook. We feel that he was not quite lying in wait for them, but he was in Holbrook the day after Andy Cooper arrived. Commodore Owen approached the house and knocked on the front door. We think Andy was no doubt the one that received him. Commodore insisted that Andy submit himself to arrest. Andy declined quite noisily. And with that, Commodore Owens leveled his rifle and shot.
I got a warrant for you, Andy.
Yeah, what about?
It's about what we talked about before.
Well, I'll see about it. Wait.
Come now!
I won't come!
Owens waited a moment. When no other gunman came out, he put the Winchester in the cradle of his left arm and turned his back on the house.
Samuel Houston Blevins stepped out on the porch with a gun pointed at Owens. And his mother was trying to hold him back, but Sam Houston had the gun pointed toward Owens, and Owens shot him, killed him dead on the spot.
His testimony at the inquest, for example, reveal a man who was not given to very many words. I walked up, I said, "Cooper, I want you." Cooper said, "Wait." He said, "I don't wait, I shot him." That's what the testimony says. Quite a guy.
As Owens walked away from the bloody scene, Frank Watron approached him and said, "Do you think you got them?" "I know I have," Owens said. "When I draw a bead, I know I've got something." In all the wild events of Arizona's wildest days, there is nothing to surpass this affair for reckless bravery on the part of a peace officer. Owens mounted his horse and left town while the commotion died down. He had stared death square in the face in the image of Andy Cooper, and he had not blinked. Owens returned to St. John's with the warrant for Cooper's arrest that he had gone to serve. Will Barnes reported that across the face of it, Owens had written, "Party against whom this warrant was issued was killed while resisting arrest." Owens' testimony at the inquest into the shooting had him simply saying, "I shot him," when Cooper refused to submit to arrest.
Come now!
An inquest was ordered into the shootings, especially in the death of the boy. Many testify that over the years Commodore Owens admitted regret in the killing of Sam Houston Blevins, but he theorized that a boy could pull a trigger just as easily as a man. Commodore Owens stayed in office for only one term.
His era was over. You know, he was definitely a frontiersman. He was a guy who shot first and asked questions later. People didn't want that kind of law enforcement anymore. They didn't need it anymore. He'd gotten rid of all the bad guys. He'd either sent them off to prison or he'd killed them.
On May 10th, 1919, he died and was buried in Flagstaff. In late September, shortly after the shootout in Holbrook, Sheriff Billy Mulvaney and a posse of men rode into Pleasant Valley, determined to bring all combatants in the killings to justice. They hid themselves behind some stone walls near Perkins' store. When John Graham and Charlie Blevins approached the store on horseback, Sheriff Mulvaney ordered them to put up their hands. When Graham and Blevins went for their guns, the posse's guns roared. Both men were killed.
Charlie Blevins was lying in the ground writhing in pain. Houck ran over thinking that he was still alive somewhat and was going to shoot him to finish him off. Houck was a very close ally of the Tewksburys, so the posse certainly had an ulterior motive in trying to do in the Grahams.
Ranchers along the Pleasant Valley territory were tired of the bloodshed and rustling. Many of them, reportedly led by Colonel Jesse Ellison, organized a committee of 50 to clear the bad element out of the country.
There were some very large Texas herds that were wanting to come into the grass of Pleasant Valley. They couldn't come in here because their herds would be stolen. One of the largest ones had brought a big herd in just the previous year. And by spring, when he came back to round them up, almost every one of them was gone. So these ranchers and the men who worked for them, who were, by the way, mostly very sturdy West Texas cowboy types, got together and decided they were going to clean out the valley. Once the rustlers and the horse thieves were all gone, then they could bring their herds in.
On August the 11th, 1888, the vigilante mobs hung 3 suspected cattle and horse thieves, Stott, Scott, and Wilson. It seems that Stott was the target of the lynching, and a groove on the tree branch served as evidence that he may have been raised and lowered several times before actually being hung to die. Perhaps this was done in an effort to get a confession, or more names out of him. Whatever the reason, it shows the cruelty of the vigilantes.
The vigilantes always seem to consist of a good contingency of the Tewksbury faction. So we really don't know if the vigilantes enlisted the Tewksburys to help them, or the Tewksburys enlisted the so-called vigilantes to give them a hand. The vigilante force didn't really seem to do much except to do in a few of the Graham sympathizers. If they had really been a vigilante force trying to clean up the area of horse thieves, as they had claimed, they probably would have gone after a lot of other men, conceivably even the Tewksburys, because as the Mormons always reported, they felt, in the early days at least, that the Tewksburys were the biggest horse thieves in Pleasant Valley.
Well, today's people, especially the descendants of these men who lived in this time, in this area, should realize that times were different then. Men were different then. Life was very harsh, and especially on a frontier like Pleasant Valley was. There was no such thing as the Miranda rights, no 911, and with all of the appeals that go on for 20 or 30 years after a conviction. There was no law, no judge anywhere around. When they came across something, somebody stealing their cattle, there was only one thing to do, and that was to take care of it themselves. People today have no idea what life was like back then. They don't think it's possible that their great-great-grandfather did something like this. They did, but they had to. And I don't think that any of us should judge those people.
Whether it was because of the killing of his brother John by a posse or the threats of vigilante groups, Tom Graham left the Pleasant Valley area and moved his operations to Tempe, Arizona. There he began life anew and full of promise. Tom married Annie Melton, and they soon had a child. He became respected and liked all around the Tempe area, where his new ranch was established. For almost 5 years, Edwin Tewksbury stewed with the vicious murder of his brother John. It was reported that Tom Graham wrote letters to Edwin Tewksbury, threatening to return and kill him. Mary Ann Tewksbury, John's widow, had remarried John Rhodes, a friend of her murdered husband. Many believed that she wanted revenge. Edwin Tewksbury decided that Mary Ann had suffered long enough. If Tom Graham must die for his actions in the Pleasant Valley War, then it was his duty to see it was taken care of, because he had brought Tom to the valley. In the early morning hours of August 2nd, 1892, Tom Graham was loading his wagon in Tempe. Edwin Tewksbury rode up and shot the unarmed Tom Graham in the back.
Tom! It's your time!
Late July, Edwin made the trip from Pleasant Valley to Tempe to settle his hash, Tom Graham's hash, supposedly, and that's what he did. August 2nd, 1892, he shot him off the hay wagon in Tempe. And he shot him in the back. It's true, he shot him in the back. But he called out to him. He wanted him to know who was shooting him. And he said, "It's your turn, Tom, it's your time." And he wanted Tom Graham to know who was shooting him. Tom Graham stood up on the hay wagon and turned around and looked back over his shoulder, so he saw who was shooting him. I know that's the fact because my grandmother, Bertha Tewksbury, told me that. And this is the rifle that Tom Graham was killed with. This was the rifle shot by the last man, Uncle Edwin Tewksbury.
Thus ended the bloodiest feud and range war ever fought on American soil. It has been virtually forgotten in history and old Western folklore. Heirs and survivors of the feud, along with historians and authors, differ dramatically on their interpretations of what really transpired. These preceding events have become virtually forgotten. If range wars, feuds, and gunfights are going to be remembered for the lessons of history, then the events of Pleasant Valley and Holbrook, Arizona are as vital as any to show the maturity of a state, and even a nation. For this range war was the biggest and bloodiest in American history. The importance of our history cannot be denied, nor the lessons forgotten, if we want to bridge the gap to our not too distant past.